Today, we're going to be focusing on domestic violence and how to approach that in a counselling space. Minela, Sue, and Annie are here with you this week.
So I think for us, it's first about identifying, is this domestic and family violence? So you need to know what that is. So we call it domestic and family violence, but most commonly it's known as domestic violence. Underneath that, it's an umbrella term for intimate partner violence or family violence. So regardless of your sexual orientation or your relationship type, an intimate partner relationship is like your boyfriend, your husband, your wife, all of that. Family violence is more like sibling to sibling violence, child to mother, teens, all of that. Though we have different perspectives of when teenagers use violence versus adults who use violence. And so, usually within the domestic violence space or in the counseling space, we would need to do an assessment to really actually identify, is this actually domestic or family violence? Mm. Most people feel like intimate partner violence or family domestic violence is only physical, but it's not. So, there's multiple categories. So, we have the physical violence, which is shoving, pushing, pulling towards the more extreme instances, would be like choking, but anything that makes you feel physically unsafe. Then we have emotional or psychological violence. Underneath that would be things like gaslighting, manipulating, verbal abuse, anything that really affects your sense of safety emotionally or psychologically. Then there's spiritual or cultural violence, which can also tie into religious violence. That could be things like not allowing you to attend church or engage in cultural or religious activities. Then we have financial violence. So that's more around, could be access to money to make work decisions, any financial decisions really, or your ability to earn income. And then we have isolation, which is kind of in a category of its own, in the sense that oftentimes when you get into a relationship with someone who's a perpetrator, they will try and isolate you from your family or friends. Because really, in the center of all of these different types of violence, we see in the domestic violence space is this need for power and control. So, what is the perpetrator doing in any of these instances to gain more power, to gain more control, to have the victim do what they want them to do?
Right. Okay. Yeah. That was another question I was going to delve into, but you answered it for me already, was the sense of control and power dynamic
Mm,
that is kind of quite clearly the driver of this kind of
mm.
relationship issue.
Yeah. And I should note that also sexual violence is another category that I forgot to mention. So that's just down to a person making you do anything that you don't consent to or don't feel comfortable with sexually. And I guess on the more pointier end of some of the cases we see, we look for certain high risk factors, like I mentioned, sometimes physical, sexual violence, strangulation, those type of things would help us assess the level of lethality that a perpetrator could have against a victim. Because unfortunately, where it stands right now in Australia is that one woman a week is killed by a current or past partner. So it is something that's kind of, I guess, gender, the culture, the way in which women are seen in our society, in Australia at least. A lot of these things can uphold certain ideas around domestic violence being normalized and okay. And it's gotten better over time, but this is still the reality that we deal with.
It kind of scares me that you say that it improved over time and we're still at 1 week.
Well, I'm not sure about like historical stats. I mean, I know where we are right now and where we've been in the last few years, but I'm talking about support services.
Mm.
Now, every single time you call the police and they show up to your house, you will automatically get referred into a domestic violence service. We'll try and call you, send you SMSs with other safe numbers that you can contact, like emergency housing, after hours crisis support. 1-800 RESPECT is 24-hour domestic violence counseling. So maybe some of the attitudes and some of the culture have changed over time. I don't know if you remember those "if you see something, say something" ads that were on TV. Like that's something in the 80s and 90s or even early 2000s would never have been on TV. And so I think they are trying to change the broader cultural narrative. The Dan Andrews government pledging to support millions of dollars into domestic violence services. Like there's been shifts and moves, but yeah, there's still a long way to go.
I think one of the things that we discussed before coming on to talk about this was, the couples counselling. Why isn't it encompassing the help that we provide people who are escaping domestic violence?
Or even presenting whether or not they're with or without their partner. Or look, maybe I'm extremely ignorant on the whole topic, but I guess to me as a counsellor, if someone was presenting experiencing family violence in some way, shape or form, it might have occurred to me to suggest, oh, well, maybe we can look at couples counselling.
I think within the domestic violence space, usually if someone calls in and they say, "Oh, I think, or maybe I am in a relationship," we would do an assessment with them, a risk assessment. And in that risk assessment, we would talk about current and historical risk of violence. So we'd ask questions like, when an incident has happened between the two of you, what does the worst incident look like? We want to know, like, when they were the most frightened or the most scared, like, what did that involve? Damage of property? Did that involve physical or sexual violence? We want to know, what they've experienced and then enact a safety plan around it. If you're providing counseling to someone and they're coming to you and they're saying, I have fights with my husband all the time and he says these things that hurt my feelings, you might suspect like, oh, okay, there might be some elements of verbal abuse here or financial control, which is saying my husband doesn't let me control the money. And I keep saying he and husband and referring to male perpetrators just to reflect the kind of current statistics that show that majority of perpetrators are within even same-sex relationships and things like that. I have to add a caveat that there's all these other things we have to consider. But in the way I'm talking about it today, we have to take a gendered lens when we're looking at domestic violence just because it reflects the rates that we're seeing now. But yeah, we would do a risk assessment, we'd do some safety planning, and we might think, oh, let's invite them to a couples counseling space. But before we even present that invitation, that risk assessment usually guides us. Oftentimes, when people call our service, we kind of have a blanket rule that says, if you identify that you're in an abusive relationship or we've done the assessment with you and we're like, oh, if you say no to this person or if you disagree with this person, that automatically leads to an escalation in violence. Well, you might feel emboldened and safe in the couples counseling space to say, this is what he does and this is what I don't like and whatever. But as a therapist, how am I going to guarantee that when we finish or you leave out of that session, everything that you've disclosed, which, a perpetrator of family violence wants to have power and control. If they feel like they're in settings where they lose that power and control, or let's say you're engaging with a therapist that might be encouraging you to think of a trial separation or something like that, we have to be really mindful that that might escalate risk for her.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think it's really difficult. And often if we really clearly identify family violence, we say couples counseling is not safe. But there's a difference between confirming that someone is in an abusive relationship versus someone who's experiencing, I don't know, financial overwhelm or parenting struggles and they're disagreeing with their spouse, or maybe they're going through infidelity or something else and they want to work through that. But you don't feel as a therapist or as a worker that them engaging in that work is going to lead to negative outcomes or an increase of risk of violence because of something that's said in that session.
Yeah. Thank you so much for highlighting that, because it's now that you've said it, it makes so much sense. And it even clicked for me another aspect of understanding like family systems and family relationships, and how in some dynamics or in many dynamics, people take on particular roles, right? So you've got this system, whether it's family violence or, a relationship, you've taken on a particular role. And this is something that I often give out for psychoeducation to my own clients, is that yes, you need boundaries and you need to start working on placing boundaries to keep yourself safe, to keep yourself, mentally well. However, there is going to be pushback from the people in your system if you are firmly placed in a particular role that keeps them in control of the situation, or, seeds their sort of system in a way. For example, if this person is in the black sheep of the family role, I'm the scapegoat, I'm always the person that people blame, then within that system, if they start to remove themselves from that or start to recognize, actually, no, I'm not that person and I am capable, I can do things. When they start to push against that system, the rest of the system really almost becomes more aggressive. So, this concept of, yeah, sure, the perpetrator and the victim can sit in a room and maybe they feel as though this is a safe space to talk about whatever they need to talk about. But the minute they leave that room, the dynamic has really shifted and it can absolutely cause major pushback or just a pretty high risk situation.
And I think when you consider like the gendered nature of a majority of family violence cases, like if you have a difficult relationship with your mother and you decide to set some boundaries, and as a result of those boundaries, you get a lot of verbal abuse. But let's say your mother's elderly or she lives far away. So she calls you and, really hurts you, emotionally abuses you. I would still class that as family violence. And there is a pushback and an escalation from you setting those boundaries,
Yeah.
right? But that's really different from a scenario where, you know, your relationship with your husband has been marred with physical abuse. And then you finally say, let's go to couples counseling. And you decide to go to couples counseling. And after the first session, he feels ashamed or humiliated or embarrassed because you've said all these things. And then you're going home, living with someone who is physically stronger than you, can intimidate you, can overpower you.
And quite likely incapable of sitting with shame, embarrassment, guilt, whatever that is. Obviously unable to sit with that feeling and they take it out on their partner. So if that's been brought up in front of somebody else and they're feeling that, then
Which kind of brings us down to this question of like, why does it happen in the first place? Like, why are the statistics so high? And I feel like there's a few reasons. So the first could be learned behavior. So if you've grown up in a household where family violence in any form, like maybe your dad always controlled the money, so you grow up feeling like I should always control the money as a man, or yelling or abusing each other verbally was just kind of normal, even sometimes culturally acceptable. Like some families who are just, very aggressive with each other, and that's really normalized. Sometimes even religious underpinnings might have elements where you feel like people are using cultural, spiritual, religious justifications as to why certain people should control the money in the relationship, or, there's a power imbalance and it's kind of supported by these things. Sometimes mental health or drug and alcohol, not a cause, but definitely exacerbates, especially in Victoria here, we see a huge amount of correlation between perpetrators of family violence, but also using ice.
Yeah.
So certain drugs can really exacerbate that behavior. Anything that kind of creates mass paranoia, you don't sleep, you don't eat. So it can make those type of stalking behaviors and surveillance be kind of really more prominent. So it can be childhood trauma as well, not to excuse it, but just to understand it. That sometimes perpetrators will say, oh, this is what my dad was like to me growing up, or, oh, I just can't control my feelings. Like we often hear this sense of like, I just lose control, or like, I need anger management. But the way that we see it is it's always a choice. Plenty of times you've been in a situation with a friend, a partner. These perpetrators can go and hold a job and not explode at their boss. They can work with a coworker and disagree and not verbally abuse them. So oftentimes there's this kind of weirdness of like, well, how is this person's losing control constantly with me? But in every other dynamic, if they had talked to their boss or a stranger on the street the way that they talk to me, and that's the thing. That's why it kind of really grows in isolation, because most of the times people don't see it evolving. Nobody gets into a relationship with a perpetrator and straight away is like, oh, red flags, I see them. Oftentimes it's like orange flags, or maybe even for an extended period of time, it's a really beautiful relationship. And then it slowly over time evolves where that person is enacting more power or more control. And oftentimes victims have acts of resistance, like saying, no, I know you don't like that friend, but I'm going to go see her. Or, yeah, you might not like what I'm wearing, but I want to wear that. It's just that over time, you kind of get whittled down in your acts of resistance. And the consequences to those acts of resistance is isolation or stonewalling or putting you down, picking fights. So eventually going to see your friend, you feel like it's not worth the argument. Or you just wear what your partner wants because you don't want to upset him. And then over time, you just start realizing, oh, wow, like so much of my relationship is based on what makes this person comfortable. And that's not what it was like in the beginning. So it's often that ambivalence that we can spend years of our life in a relationship that's abusive and not really come to terms with the fact that it is abusive until either somebody points it out or something really bad happens.
Does the perpetrator know that they are perpetrating domestic violence, or do they just go on thinking that, oh, this is just normal? As you said, trauma, or, the way they were taught this is how it works. Do they at some point go, oh, I am actually perpetrating domestic violence on my partner?
I think it's like any behavioral problem where sometimes the choice to do it, look, I feel like in a majority of the cases that I've seen, they know what they're doing. They're aware,
Yeah.
or they're aware, but maybe it's their own insecurities. Like we've had cases where, boyfriends or husbands have been incredibly jealous. So they've isolated their partner or constantly accused them of cheating. And then when they go to therapy or speak to a worker to kind of unpack that, you start to realize that it's coming more from their own sense of insecurity, which goes back to this idea of like, why do they do it? And insecurity and feeling not good enough sometimes are major drivers. Because think about it. Why would you want to control someone and have power over someone? Sometimes a lot of these men have major fears of abandonment. So they feel like the only way they can keep a relationship is to control all facets of it. And there's varying levels of awareness. Some people are really so aware and they've done it to multiple partners, and we have long histories on our systems. And then we have other people who, kind of a bit more ambivalent, or they go to a men's behavior change program or something. And then through deepening their empathy and really developing what it must feel like for their partner or for their child to witness them lose it, smash things, get angry, really taking them out of their experience of the anger and putting them into how really kind of developing that empathy of like another perspective, then they start to frame, oh, okay, this is what it might feel like for little Timmy to see me go off. And if it's important to me to be a good father, and if that's one of my major drivers, if I think, oh, maybe I'm a shit husband, but I'm a good father, it's about gently challenging them to see it from a different perspective, from the child's perspective, and then start to realize, oh, maybe my kid's scared of me and I don't want that. So how can I deal with my emotions? Which is another thing, lack of emotional regulation skills, sometimes a lack of empathy. And sometimes, yeah, that comes from modeling. Oftentimes, the majority of the men that come through our service, like when you ask them about their family histories, you find out that their father was a perpetrator of family violence.
And they are just kind of expressing their emotions or behaving in the way that they have learned is the way that you express that. The other thing I guess I wanted to ask you, which is it is around that sort of emotion regulation, feeling uncomfortable or maybe having something that feels too vulnerable or too scary. And so anger comes in as a secondary emotion. And that's often the case, especially with the clients that I see. We talk a lot about how we express anger or, any emotion. That the groups that I work with are unable to kind of sit with any negative or uncomfortable emotion. And then so they're using or they're drinking to keep that at bay. And there are lots and lots of instances where we talk about anger and how anger comes in to, I guess, act as this like defense mechanism for fear, for vulnerability, for shame. It comes and sits on top, and anger is protecting them from those really, I don't know, softer, more vulnerable emotions. And then the urge that comes with anger, because we're not able to control it. It's coming from like the amygdala, not the frontal cortex. That part of our brain is emotion driven, it's urge driven. And so when anger comes in, the safety mechanism or the defense mechanism of that is aggression, or be big and be scary and hit things or yell. And so I wonder if there's this like, real need for emotion regulation techniques and learning for young men, because they're really stuck not knowing how to feel vulnerable. And then they get this anger urge on top to keep them safe and protect them from that really soft underbelly, I guess.
I feel like it is a big problem within men, because when you think about emotions that are safe or encouraged for men to express, anger is like at the top of the list for all of them. Like, you do well in a sport game, you're like, "Rah," you rough play with people. Anger is just whether you feel sad, you're not allowed to cry, you're not allowed to feel any of those soft feelings. Anything associated with femininity is shut down or just called out to be, in a homophobic way, like gay or something like that. So oftentimes there's this association between masculinity and
Aggression.
hypersexuality and aggression, right? And that's like this idea of what being masculine or a man is, which is changing over time. Just like in the kind of opposite end of the coin, sometimes women feel like to be feminine is to be submissive, to compromise. And that's why when we look at family and domestic violence, we have to apply a gendered lens, not just because the statistics kind of back us up, but that when you look at the way men and women are taught to interact in relationships, think about how many women you've spoken to who you feel like are essentially teaching emotion regulation to their adult partners, like teaching them how to access their vulnerability, apologize, work through their emotions, and like really doing the job of a therapist.
Yeah. I think it's more about processing as well. I
Yeah.
feel that this is my opinion is that anger doesn't have to be associated with aggression or negativity, right? It can be angry. But how do you deal with that anger? Not just punch someone,
Yeah.
punch a wall, whatever. How can someone still have that anger and just go, okay, what is it telling me? Why am I feeling angry? And then working with that.
But also anger within which dynamic? Like, if you're my husband and I'm the wife and I'm angry, I could yell and scream, and sure, I could push you and maybe get really physical if that's kind of like the level of our relationship where we're getting at. But as a man, you might never feel physically or sexually vulnerable, no matter how angry I am. There isn't this overt, for a majority of couples, pressure that you feel like I could intimidate you.
No, but what I'm saying is that as a man, maybe instead of acting out on the anger in a physical way, it's turning that anger back into yourself and saying, what am I angry about? You know,
Oh,
trying,
yeah.
trying to kind of process that instead of acting out and
Yeah.
letting that amygdala take
Yeah.
over.
Yeah, I think you're talking
Yeah.
about how to safely process the
Yeah.
emotion. And I'm talking about consider the dynamic that you're processing and why there is this huge epidemic of family violence or intimate partner violence. It's because women too feel anger. Women too get angry. I think this is a huge misconception because people say, oh, women can be violent, women can be angry too. It's like, yes, they can, but has a man, or do a majority of men feel unsafe when a woman expresses her anger versus most women who feel very unsafe when a man expresses their anger? It could be at a public footy event or something like that. Like the physical stature, the power dynamic in the room, not just maybe greater financial power, but greater physical power. All of that means that engaging in a safe therapeutic conversation, even to express anger, um, it has to be something that the both people can genuinely say, I can walk into this room and feel safe doing, not like, oh, I can maybe be safe in this space and I can help him regulate. Because a lot of people try and do this themselves in their own couples when they're having arguments at home. But they always have to think at the back of their mind, oh, I can't push this person too far because at any point they could overpower me. So there's that layer. That's why, couples counseling is such a touchy topic that we don't often recommend. We think it's actually better to work with the people separately because also within a couples counseling space, there's what you want, what I want, and then there's this third entity of the relationship. And if one person in a relationship wants something different than the other, in the context of family violence, that's actually really unsafe. And the hardest moments in a lot of couples counseling, when a lot of people come to couples counseling, is actually because they're at breaking point. They're thinking about separating, like separation might be on the table. Most people don't access it as they're going along through problems. It's kind of sometimes a last ditch effort. And our research says that separation is the highest risk time for a victim to leave.
That's exactly what I was just about to ask you was, I know that as, I guess, a general understanding. And I think that's becoming more clear to, I guess, general population of understanding. But there is still this like underlying theme or question that people might have when, someone's been in an abusive or a domestic violence relationship or situation for quite some time. And there are people who are aware of it. And those people are kind of just saying, why don't you just leave?
There are a few reasons. I think, first and foremost, in no order of importance, I think most relationships that are abusive had huge elements of isolation. So if you've been in a relationship where multiple times you have told family and friends of what this person has done, and they tell you leave that person and you choose to stay because they promised they would never do it again, you're probably not going to reach out and tell those people again because they're going to look at you as, why don't you leave? So it's been become incredibly isolating.
It's almost like the same stigma as like relapsing
Yes.
from alcohol or drug use. Like if you've been sober for a while and you relapse, and like relapsing to a lot of people is like crushing, the worst shame you could possibly experience. And it's like, no, but that is literally like part of the disease is it happens. You're going to relapse at some point, probably. Right.
And by the time clients call us, and if they say, like, I've left 3 times, why did I go back? I say to them that the average is 9 attempts. That's the average. And
until it like
and
sticks.
the average amount is 9 times. Some people do it in less, some people do it in more, but there's so many complicated factors. So we talked about the isolation that happens. Then we talk about the attachment and the hope. So, as I said before, when you get into a relationship, they're not perpetrating straight away. At least most of them often start really nice, really charming. So you don't know what it's going to become. And then it becomes something that you are not happy with, and you have acts of resistance and you have arguments and maybe really big blow ups, but you have this attachment to this person, love for them. And then on top of that, you have this hope that it's going to get better. And especially if that person has apologized and maybe taken responsibility or accountability or assured you, but it keeps happening. So sometimes it's the hope that kind of keeps you there. Then the finances. It's really difficult if you are living with someone, have children with someone, have money with someone. Most women might not have finances or resources to be able to separate. Family that can help them or anything. Luckily now in the domestic violence space, there's a lot of resources. We have crisis emergency housing. We have the escaping family violence payment. We have even a Centrelink crisis payment. And then just general brokerage for material aid. We can give people safe phones. We can put them in hotels. Like there's a lot more, I guess, available options. Another thing is like complicating factors. Sometimes there's a lot of shame and guilt around separation, especially if the person who is perpetrating against you doesn't really fit the typical idea of a perpetrator. Like, say, for instance, if your partner's been struggling with alcohol abuse or drug abuse and you've always been, or like disability and you've always been their carer or something like that. And then if it becomes abusive, you might feel these conflicting feelings of like, oh, but they're struggling with a disease or they're really unwell. Lately, we've been having a really high increase of like elderly people who have got dementia or different kind of health problems that's kind of resulting in them feeling frustrated, like not knowing where they are and lashing out and being abusive. And they kind of come to our service and we can safety plan with the family and offer a few supports and whatnot. But this is really kind of like a mental kind of condition or disability that's forming, like their brain is really aging. And part of that is a frustration at like not knowing where your things are, maybe not recognizing people, and then there's these anger outbursts or
Right.
damage in property. So, yeah, it can be so complex and varied. But yeah, there's a lot of reasons why people stay. And children are like a massive one. If you think that the majority of the cohort of women who experience family violence are women who are pregnant, women who are trying to leave the relationship, and women who, oftentimes are like entering into their second or third pregnancy. Because oftentimes for women, having a baby and having a focus on something outside of the relationship. And think about when you have a baby, maybe if you have a mom or a dad or family, they're always around you. Maybe people want to support and be there. To a perpetrator, that's all just really inconvenient. The focus is not on them. And so we often would consider it quite high risk if a woman is pregnant or has a newborn because violence escalates during that time. Women are focused on their baby or their pregnancy. They're not focused on meeting whatever the perpetrator wants them to do. I'm pretty sure that someone once said in the general population, there's either 3 or zero point 0.3. I don't remember the exact statistic.
It's actually less than 3%.
Yeah, less than 3% of
percent of
people
people
clinically diagnosed with
with
narcissism. The fact that it's so common would mean that there are all these people out there that are absolutely pathological. And it's not. It really isn't. It's really just kind of like normalized. It can be rooted in culture, tradition, religion, gender based values. If you've grown up with this idea that women should cook and clean, speak when spoken to, all of that, or if that's how you feel towards your children, this idea of them having any source of independence, earning their own money, having friends, having people that you don't like around them, all these things threaten your ability to have control over that person and maybe what your expectations are. And if you look back, our relationships have historically fit more of a traditional base. And with every generation, there's like women only entered the workforce. Like uh, when is where was it? 50s. There we go.
even 40, because women had to go to work when men had to go to war.
Yeah. Look, all I know is that we have been getting rights over time.
Yes. But also, I think on your point, Annie, is it's not narcissism as such. And I think you touched on it, is the insecurity of men that drives them to feel that they need to control, the people in their lives. Because if they don't have control, that means that they have failed somehow as whatever they think they need to succeed in, whether it be upbringing, whether it be loss of control or loss of faith, whatever it is. Yeah.
And domestic violence is a men's issue. It's not a woman's
Mm.
issue. I could support 1,000 victims,
Mm.
but that perpetrator in the time that I support one victim could go and perpetrate 3 more times.
Mm.
And the systems that we have in place to support men is if they're willing to, which it's rare,
Yeah.
to go to individual one-on-one counseling, private, go and see someone who specializes in working with men who use violence. Can't be your run-of-the-mill
Mm.
counselor.
But how do these men come into your orbit, or come into orbit where they get help?
So in our service, which is state government domestic violence service, majority of the men come through from police referrals.
Oh, okay.
So neighbor calls or the victim calls, or maybe they're seen on the street, police intervene, and they automatically send a referral for the victim. And if they have children, it's connected together. And then a separate referral for whoever is identified as the perpetrator.
Right.
And then we have at our workplace workers that just work with perpetrators and workers that just work with victims.
That never crossed my mind. It's like, well, yes, there's the victim, but how does what do we do for the perpetrator?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they get the referral, and oftentimes, if depending on the significance of the incident, they might have to go to court and get an intervention order. So that's more of a civil proceeding that kind of tries to intervene at that level. And then if they breach that order, it becomes a criminal charges at a criminal level. So that's a whole other thing. And then if it goes even further, then we're looking at jail and incarceration. But it's usually through referrals through police. There's the men's referral line, which is like a helpline men can call and then do an assessment, get linked in. And then usually when they're at court for an intervention order, off the back of a police intervention like report, they will be court ordered to attend a men's behaviour change program.
Does the victim have to agree to press charges for that to happen, or is that just automatic? Once there's a victim, there's a perpetrator, and that perpetrator has to go through the police or
So basically, when there's a family violence incident, it's not the victim versing the perpetrator, it's the police versing the perpetrator, and the victim is listed as a witness to the crime. So what that means is, and if you think about the scope of like within the banner of family violence, if I'm in an abusive relationship and my husband hits me, the neighbor calls the police come. I know that if I tell the police what he did, he's going to make it worse for me. So I say to the police, "Oh, I don't know how this happened. I don't want to do anything." Police make an assessment. They usually separate the couple. They want to see what individual stories they have and if it matches or it's something completely different. But usually, if it's a significant event, like they can see property damage or any bruises, physical violence, automatically on the spot, they will say, "Look, we're worried that this is family domestic violence. Even if both of you deny it, we're going to separate you for the night." And they can organize emergency accommodation for the perpetrator, or they can go and stay at a family or friend's house until they go to court, which is often the next day. When you go into court the next day, first things you come into court, you have to come in through separate entrances, and you'll have a lawyer that represents the police come up to you as the victim and say, "Hey, we cited those bruises last night. We spoke to your neighbor or we spoke to him, his lawyer. This is what we as police want to do. We want to apply for a basic or a full intervention order. Often they go for 12 months, they can go for years, but it's rare. Do you consent to this?" And sometimes me, who worked as a court applicant worker at the magistrate's court, I would say to the woman, "Look, these are your rights." You can say to the police, "Sure, I will agree with it." But most of the time, women who are in really quite high risk situations will say, "Please don't put this order in place." Like, one, he might not respect it and he'll break it anyway. And I'm not going to call the police on him because I don't want to get in trouble with him. Or two, there's no way I'm going to support this because if I support you, he'll take it out on me and you guys won't be able to protect me the whole time. So if a woman is adamant based on that, then she can ask to be appointed a separate lawyer because essentially when you go to court, police are your lawyer. They're the ones taking him to court, not you, which is a common misconception. So you can actually disagree with the police and say to the judge, "Yeah, this is my version of the events," or "I don't want the order because of XYZ. I don't feel like I need it," or "I need him to help me with the kids," or "there's a disability." And there are sometimes extenuating circumstances, but oftentimes the magistrate or the judge is making a ruling based off of probability of risk because we're in the civil courts. It's not a criminal trial where he speaks and you speak. No, it's just the police presenting. His lawyer gets an opportunity to say something. And oftentimes, if the judge suspects that there's family violence, she or he would rather err on the side of caution and say, "Look, I'll give you guys a 12-month basic order," which means it has two conditions: no form of family violence, no damage of property. For 12 months. If you guys don't call the police, if nothing happens, it's not going to come up in a criminal history check. It's not going to affect your employment, anything. It's just for protection. And that allows the couple to live together, parent together, do everything together. And sometimes it might be the thing that makes them be like, "Okay, maybe my partner's struggling with drug and alcohol or depression, mental health disability. And actually, we need help. We need someone to intervene." And that's when our services step in and say, "Should we refer you guys to separate counseling?"
I feel like for the judge to make a call that could send a woman back to an abusive partner and she could end up unalive. That
What I I think the good part about it is that because they do err on the side of caution,
Mm.
for anything that comes through that's often like verbal abuse, anything that's like a threat to kill or threat to harm, anything that children witness or experience, anything that's sexual or physical violence, oftentimes is met with it's a full order, meaning you cannot be within 5 meters of the
Like,
person. You can't be 200 meters from where they live or work. You can't call them. You can't post about them. You can't get anybody to do anything that you're not allowed to do. And it includes all these conditions around social media and online. So it's really kind of like this full restraining order. But the reality is, so many of the couples that we've worked with in the past, whether it's through coercion from the perpetrator or whether it's just, other extenuating or intersecting things like drug and alcohol, mental health, you can have the order and you cannot follow it. We've had couples that have had really big blow ups and then they've both been given an order, maybe cross against each other, that they both can't see each other because they've both been identified as victims and perpetrators. And they will walk out the courtroom in separate entrances and then get in the car and drive back home together. But oftentimes it's the pressure of the perpetrator. That's why it's hard to leave. That's another reason why women in particular don't leave, because of the children and the changes in the family dynamic, caring responsibilities, people who are in situations where it's not just their culture, their religion, their family, the cultural pressures. It's not just the isolation and lack of support. It's not just their lack of resources or finances or job. It's the lack of housing. And most women will say it's about the impact on their children. What I will say to that is I understand every case is unique and different, but when we're talking about child development and the impacts of family violence on children long term, the fact that most perpetrators of family violence grew up in a household where there was violence, one could argue that would it be better for you to separate from an abusive situation that your children are either being abused or witnessing abuse, which when it comes to the brain, especially to young brains, is the same thing, you know? Sometimes men have better financial resources than women. Men oftentimes in most households are the primary breadwinner. So even if they do move out, they're moving out with all their financial capital, their job, their whatever. And so many women, I'm not even going to call Centrelink to ask for a single parenting payment because the backlash of doing that, the escalation in violence, or child support payments if they've gone through the separation process, and in the family law court if you want to have full custody of the children. Like, you can understand why it's such an overwhelming thing. Whether you do or you don't have children, there's all these layers of complexity as to why someone leaves. So when I feel like someone's like, why doesn't she leave? It just really upsets me because I don't think they've actually sat down and thought through all the things that we've discussed today, which make it so incredibly hard. And you can understand why they stay.
And she doesn't feel like she's getting the support from the court or anything. It's hard.
And I don't think
So
the
hard.
systems are set up to support the sheer volume. Housing is probably our biggest barrier. Our next barrier is really the family law court system and how family law court orders trump intervention orders.
Don't they take years?
Yeah. And thousands of dollars.
Doesn't have years, and she doesn't have thousands of dollars. And I'm saying she, but I'm sure there are thousands of women in the same situation who have been able to leave, but are now in just as shit situations as they could find themselves anyway.
Which, look, I do feel like, because I've supported so many clients over long term, people who are ambivalent, not sure if they were in an abusive relationship, not ready to leave, but then did leave, dealt with all the kind of negative stuff from leaving, but then eventually established themselves, got their kids into new schools, set up these whole lives. And it does really get better. This isn't to discourage or dissuade anyone from leaving an abusive relationship. If anything, I would encourage you to do it before there's more entanglements, be it financial, children, or anything, because, yeah, those things do add layers of complexity. But I feel like I've worked with people, rich, poor, children, didn't have children. Like, this is genuinely an issue that touches every area of society. Doesn't matter how much money you have or how much resources or families, friends, or It could really genuinely happen to anyone. And I really want to focus on, because I'm conscious we're finishing up soon, this idea of what to do, how to help someone who you think is in that situation. And I think for like the average layman, I would say just listen to them when they come to you to talk about the relationship. Don't judge them. Make them feel safe and supported. Try really hard to tamper some of your reactions, because oftentimes the person who's coming to you to tell you the violent thing the person said or did, or if they hurt them, they know how bad it is. Even if they might have normalized it to some level because it's an average thing for them to be called a name every other day, they're aware that that's not normal and acceptable behavior. And if they come to you and you're like shocked, angry, indignant, because of course you love them, of course you feel that. And, you're not a specialist in family violence. So I wouldn't expect you to be perfect. But the main thing is about listening and giving that person what the perpetrator doesn't, which is a voice and agency. You don't want to replicate another relationship that they have to bend towards to please, another power dynamic where now if they go back and they stay with their boyfriend or their partner, they're going to be upsetting their sister or their mother or their best friend. You want to feel like a safe space. Trying to get them to be linked in with a counselor or a domestic violence service. Tell them they can call in anonymously. You can even help set them up, do online counseling so their partner doesn't know, or there's different ways that you can kind of get them into help, and try and create a bit of a safety plan, a bit of a code word. Stuff like if she texts you this emoji or this word, it means call me or call the police or something's happened. Encourage them to have a little go bag where they have important documents, or if they need things for the children, passports, some money. And if you feel kind of comfortable to do so, you can have all that stuff at your house. But really, in different levels of risk for family violence, it's always important to get at least a professional service involved, just so they can do a bit of a risk assessment, because you don't know what you don't know. There's been so many where we've called in and then we've found traces on their cars, that they've been monitored online, and them and their family and their friends had no clue. And oftentimes, if you're fleeing a domestic violence relationship, the perpetrator, this isn't like an online stranger who's guessing your password. They often know your mother's maiden name. They know where your friends and family live. So if you flee to those houses or try and change your passwords, it's going to be a lot. There's like added layers of complexity to really get you to a safe space. So I think getting your friend or family member to really engage with domestic violence services, creating some type of a safe word just so that they can reach out to you if they need support, and trying to really understand them, because they, just like with drug addiction, because of all those barriers we talked about, most of the time people are going to want to go and save their relationship.
I just wanted to ask you, and it may not have come up for you or in your workplace because generally people are attending your service knowing that they're in an abusive relationship. I've had instances with clients where maybe I as the therapist, or us as a treating team, have the patient has disclosed it to us, like instances of violence in the home or with their partner, or whether we've kind of gathered it from the things that they've told us. How would you approach that, or what advice might you give to a client or to a therapist where the victim doesn't think that they're a victim, or is in denial of the fact that their partner is being abusive, or just doesn't, I guess, notice, realize, understand, want to accept that this is their reality?
So I'll have to say, firstly, that we do have people that contact our service not knowing that they're in an abusive relationship. Maybe they were given our number from a friend or a counselor. I guess sometimes just saying to someone, if you think you have relationship problems or even parenting issues or any form of kind of like maybe therapeutic work, you're looking to contact this service. And when they contact us, we automatically screen for domestic and family violence. So we can kind of gather that straight away and then launch into risk assessment and safety planning. But when a person calls us and says, hey, this person gave me this number, I don't think I'm in an abusive relationship, but I just kind of want to through some of those things. Oftentimes, like the denial is a part of not wanting to accept the reality of the situation, or like such a strong hope that maybe it was a one off instance of abuse. I think what we try and do is really be very curious and be very slow in unpacking what happened and how that impacted that person, and maybe how they would have preferred if their partner reacted, and just kind of highlighting the difference in those two presentations. Or sometimes even saying to a person, if a client said something like, yeah, he got upset and he yelled at me and then he smashed the thing. And he does that sometimes. Like it's given a sense that it's almost like normalized the abuse. Sometimes I like to say, oh, well, if their child was present, how do you think the child would have seen it from that perspective? Or if your best friend called you and was upset saying, this is what my partner did, what would be your response to it? So sometimes really just taking a third person view, because oftentimes the victims I speak to can really extend a lot of compassion and empathy and understanding when their family or friends are going through something, but they might not be able to turn that towards themselves, which sometimes being in an abusive relationship can really degrade your sense of self worth, what you think you deserve. Because when you're being treated poorly, you start to believe that that's what you deserve and you learn to accept it, because over that layer of abuse is also this constant reinforcement that, oh, I wouldn't get this angry if you didn't make me angry. You didn't clean the house right. You didn't cook the way I like it. So it's using you to justify my abuse. I wouldn't be abusive if you did X, Y, Z. This kind of very conditional love. And then intermittent reinforcement, where sometimes I'll praise you, but it's so far and few between. And that's kind of what keeps the cycle going. But also value based questions, let's say someone has a son, sometimes saying, how would you feel if your son reacted that way towards his future partner? Or having certain questions that really breaks the ambivalence and has them thinking about their values, how other people around them see them, what the children's experience is of the abuse, and planting seeds about like, how would you like to be treated in an argument? How do you treat your partner in an argument? Do you sit and listen and try and control your emotions? And really just sometimes asking them to have an expectation of what they bring.
Hmm. I think that is a really valuable response and definitely has me sort of reflecting and understanding, I suppose, a lot of the dynamics of the people that I see, attempting or really trying sobriety or recovery. And I guess even in that, in sort of slowly helping them to get to a point of realization or acknowledgement, there's got to be room also for like grieving a relationship that you maybe used to have or that you thought you had, which I guess is part of that. It's like a denial almost and not wanting to face that. And I can also see that, you know, if maybe there is part of a person who does know that this is not good, I'm going to cover that up with alcohol or I'm going to cover that up with a substance. And that is going to help me to cope with whatever's going on.
And maybe it is also a little bit about the broader idea of the patriarchy and our expectations of women in society, where if sometimes, depending on your culture, where you're from, leaving can be quite shameful. Leaving a marriage, sometimes, especially if you have children, can be very shameful. But there's also been a different trend now that I feel like maybe in the last 20 years or so, maybe choosing to stay when you could have better is also become a new shame. And sometimes if you have a problem with your partner and you go and tell people, they'll say, you deserve better. And maybe you do. I'm not saying don't leave. But there's also like a counterculture that's developing where people are encouraged to separate and go off and find something better. And in the context of dating culture and Tinder and swiping and everything, sometimes people are rather holding on to something, even if it's not healthy, because they hear how difficult it is out there. And also the shame of like being alone as a woman, those cultural, I'm saying within Australia, messages that we get is like, don't end up becoming the cat lady or something. So sometimes it's like there's all this attachment, not just to the person, but like the future you could have with the person, the future children or the future plans you have, the grief of being alone, the fear of being alone, which if you think about it from the two sides of the same coin, sometimes men out of their insecurity and their fears might use power and control and commit abuse because they don't want to be alone. They want this person to make them the center of their universe and fix them. And from the victim side, even if they are being hurt or abused, for some reason, this fear of being alone is greater than staying where they're at. Because oftentimes they say, I love the person, I just don't love that behavior. And then we do have some good days. And the way we understand it, it's really a cycle of abuse where there's this build up and then an explosion or escalation and then remorse. And then it's calm and very forgiving and flowers and I'll never do it again. And then there's a lull period, and then there's a build up again, and then another. And it's this cycle of abuse that keeps happening. But sometimes it's like, to intervene with the perpetrator, we have to get them in that moment of remorse, which, if you think about the cycle of addiction,
I was literally just thinking about the cycle of addiction as you were talking about the cycle of abuse. It's almost like they could go side by side, and exactly there's that element of remorse or guilt or shame that can be a really good point to catch it, but it can also be a really downward spiral point for them to start using again. So I guess it's like, it's almost mirrored in a way.
like even when you were talking to me about addiction and I was getting to know you, I was just like, wow, there's so many similarities. And you can't tell me, like, there's so many Turkish dramas and like love stories and whatever. You can't tell me that falling in love with someone is not its own form of addiction. Because according to the brain, it is. That whole love goggle thing, it's for some people that feeling of intoxication of being with someone, even if it starts becoming very difficult. Better the devil you know, sunken cost fallacy. I've already invested so much time, so much energy, so many years. I don't want to be alone. I don't want to start again. Millions of reasons why people stay. And that's why I feel like it's this huge epidemic. And it's not about everybody having narcissism. It's about for every person, it's different and it's like a different combination. But the best thing you can do to support someone if you kind of suspect or think that they are in those situations is direct them towards the domestic violence services. 1-800-RESPECT is probably one of the best because it's 24/7, it's counseling, and you can be anonymous. And you can just call in saying, hey, I had this thing with my partner and I just want to talk to someone about it. If you don't feel comfortable talking to a friend or a family member, or the nature of your relationship is so controlling as such is that, you're not going to be feeling safe to make those calls or talk around that person. But we just often in our work in the domestic violence space, it's really just about planting seeds. That hope that your partner's going to get better one day and become a person that's not abusive, that has a lot of roots in it. What we're trying to do is sow hope and seeds for a different reality, a reality where maybe you have more financial independence. Your kids aren't scared. You have your own place. You can come home and not worry about managing or walking on eggshells around another person. And it's not easy and it can be really difficult to get there. But I've supported enough women that feel like the freedom and safety that they get from not being in that relationship outweighs all of the difficulties that they had to deal with when they're in that relationship. So a majority of our work is really just shifting that hope from believing that this person's going to change, is going to get better, which I'm not a huge believer that they can't. I just feel like they need to take responsibility, accountability, engage in therapy or men's behavior change. There's a lot of work to unlearn some of these deeply held, rooted beliefs about what a woman, what a wife, what a mother should be. And sometimes a lot of that abuse stems from a sense of entitlement and a belief in what each gender should do. And I think we've seen this huge correlation. I mean, domestic violence has always been around, but the more and more women who are becoming financially independent, buying their own properties, now suddenly we have a massive male epidemic of loneliness, guys. Like it's really huge. And I was reflecting on this, like, where is this coming from? Because men are complaining, like, oh, it's so difficult to find women. It's because before women, irrespective of how you treated women, how emotionally intelligent you were, as long as you had some source of income or by male privilege you were endowed in a society or a culture, you were guaranteed a wife. It doesn't matter what quality of father or husband you were just given a wife. It was a given. That's just what you do as you grow up. And now, and more women have financial independence and freedom and choice. Now, a lot of women are saying, well, if you can't actually be emotionally available and provide me with something apart from financial resources, I actually don't want to be in a relationship with you. I'd rather have a cat or yeah. Oh, so I think domestic violence is a bit of a symptom of a broader range of issues in our society. And I love the complexity of it. And I'll put some resources at the end of this video if you're wanting counseling, if you're wanting to access domestic violence or crisis services.
Thank you so much. That was very enlightening, opens up so much to think about in our own practices. And I mean, this conversation could have gone on for hours because there were lots and lots of questions popping up in my head, but that would add more and more to the conversation, which maybe we can explore again.
I think absolutely all of the topics that we talk about and bring up, I think part 2, part 3 will come because there's so much to dive into. But thank you so much for such an enlightening and intelligent conversation.
And I would say for any kind of professionals who are curious about it, consult, consult, consult. A lot of the community or government sectors, and I'm one of them, I provide secondary consultations to a lot of professionals, so schools, teachers, kinders, hospitals, private therapists. If you are working with a family or a couple or individual and you think that there might be elements of family violence, please do consult about it. And we're also open to members of the public. So if you have a friend or a family member who you're worried about, give us a call. It can all be anonymous. You don't have to provide us with any names. And we can just direct you to how to kind of safely support that person. But thanks for joining us today, guys. We'll see you next time. Bye.